to the 6, we be in the mix. With that rare candy paint job on the whip. I need food for the kids, money for the rent. Fuck a lockdown, baby, I can't do that shit. And I don't never vote, cause I'm fucking broke. And either way, I know the police ain't gon' leave me alone. On a plane by to visit Glen Rock. Need crypto, told me I should bring the Glock with me. So I packed up my piece and I'm sliding. Cause we might get caught up in a riot. Middle finger Trump, middle finger Biden. Fuck a left, fuck a right, is you riding? Know you love to see it, dudes rocking. Ain't no politics, baby, we just talking. From the birds to the bricks, we be in the mix. With that rare candy paint job on the whip, who you with?
Very, very special episode today. Somebody that we've wanted to get on this program for a while. We've got the great Whitney Webb today. Whitney Webb is an author, so podcaster, a researcher. I mean, researcher, I think, is the most like the best term I could use, because every bit of your work, it isn't just you shouting something, like just being like, hey, this happened, guys, please believe me and stuff. There's all sorts of stuff that corroborate that evidence and things like that. It's very thorough. It makes people who think a little bit differently actually get a little bit of reassurance in the way that they think. So first of all, welcome to the show. We really appreciate you for coming.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So I really want to talk about, when you got started doing this, like, what were you like? What was the first thing that was just like, okay, time out. Everything I knew before now was wrong. Like, what was the first thing?
Okay, so in terms of like everything I've been told in school and whatever is full of crap, that moment came way before I started writing. So that was probably back in, I was in university, by the time I graduated in 2012, I was pretty, black-pilled maybe.
Yeah.
The terminology for that. Yeah. And obviously, I didn't really know anyone else my age that felt that way about stuff, kind of isolating. And that was around the same time I moved to South America and started living down here. So I have, about over a decade down here, and I was trying to do random stuff, I guess, to make money. And eventually some website I was reading had writers needed on it, and the guy I was dating at the time was like, well, maybe you should think about writing for them, since you read their stuff so much, and you could probably do it. And I was like, no one wants to read what I have to say. And that's how I felt at the time. And I guess maybe a lot of people feel that way, because I don't think anyone looks at this space and really knows exactly how to break in and quote unquote make it right. So I guess I just at the time I was making maybe like $30 a week. Not very much money at all. And it was kind of like a sweatshop writing job. I had to do like 4 articles a day. 4 to 5 articles a day.
Oh my gosh.
And I think I got like $20 a pop, which for here in Chile at the time was actually pretty good money, because it paid in dollars,
Right.
Yeah. And then some of the stuff I did there, Mint Press News really liked, and they hired me, and I started there the beginning, January 2017. And stayed until, a little bit into 2020, and then sort of did my own thing. I teamed up with T-Lab for a while. And then I made Unlimited Hangout to kind of try and do my own project, I guess.
And I think it's funny, like you said that, like you had a significant other that was like, hey, you should do this. And like I always joke, I don't think she actually feels this way, but like, when I started, my wife was always like, you should be in broadcasting, I always like thought of it in my head as funny, be like, stop talking to me, go talk to somebody else. So I started putting that, go talk to the other crazy people. I've heard that before. Just things like that. And it is funny to have that encouragement where you're like, actually, can I, like, do you think people actually want to hear this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I mean, the reason he said it is because I was actually having a very small blog at the time, but it was in Spanish. I wasn't writing in English. It's actually much easier for me to write in English than Spanish. So I was like, well, I guess, I'll try doing English now, because it's not so bad. And I mean, it went over well, obviously. I'm still
Do you
Still
give
here
him a
doing
kickback,
stuff.
like a percentage of every, 5%? Thanks for getting me in the game.
No, but don't give him any ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was no paperwork. There was no paperwork. No
No.
anything.
Shark Tank deal.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's
Nope.
just a suggestion, I guess.
Very, very nice. Very nice. And now, you were rather early. It's become kind of like, I feel like I hear it on like mainstream things now, but like the whole Epstein thing, like you were rather early on that. If I have that correct, I remember like the day I found out, I was like probably 2017, I think, which even that was late for the amount of stuff that was coming out. But I remember thinking like, how could this be happening? Like how could this cabal of, whatever you want to say, this kind of like blackmail agent, just be like involved in every aspect of the thing that rules my life, and nobody cares. But now it's like, it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek joke in the media that people will make. Like you'll hear it on like mainstream comedy sometimes, like Epstein stuff. And like, is that discouraging a little bit that like people just kind of like laugh it off now after like,
Well, it's become like a meme, hasn't it? Like Epstein didn't kill itself, and it's like, haha. And then it's like, oh wait, crazy unaccountable government, taking away everyone's freedom, stealing everyone's money, herding everyone into like a slavery corral. And let's joke about it and meme it. I mean, I guess that the people have different ways of dealing with shit that's really dark that goes on in our world, but sometimes that stuff translates into people like, well, they're coping, right? But at the same time, it's like, there's no really action that comes out of that. It's just sort of a way to sort of divert and manage that situation without really having to, demand any sort of change from the powers that be. And I think, I kind of understand it because a lot of people don't want to acknowledge the current state of affairs,
right,
or the current state of, the government. And they want to continue to believe that like voting can change stuff and things like that. Like a lot of people have a lot of trouble leaving that particular paradigm and don't really want to have to live in a world where it's dark like that, right? But some people eventually get to the point where they're like, they don't want to live a lie, what I mean? But
totally.
some people prefer to live the lie, so it's like a journey for a lot of people, and there's a lot of different ways people cope with this stuff. But when it comes to the Epstein stuff, I mean, I think part of the problem too is how mainstream medias handle it. And it was obviously very intentional, a way of focusing just on the salacious stuff and being like, the creepy sex stuff and all of that, and not focusing, for example, on the fact that the people that enabled Epstein, nothing happened to them, right? And really, in my opinion, Epstein was someone more like middle management. And so if the people essentially responsible for him are continuing to do the same crap, I mean, you just sub out Epstein for some other dude and it just continues. So
they quite literally did it for Ghislaine Maxwell. I'm not that she wasn't implicated in it, but I just remember people kind of like, I found it like, I obviously understand wanting her to get like a bunch of punishment, but I just remember like people saying like, oh, she got sentenced to jail, and people were like planting a victory flag. And I was just like, well, yeah,
no,
but it's not,
Well, no, not at all. Because if you ask me, the whole reason why Epstein was arrested in general and why he was offed has nothing to do with his sex crimes.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It was because he pissed off somebody.
Mm-hmm.
When you get into these levels of like intelligence, organized crime, and political power, and some of these transnational power structures and stuff, there's a bunch of factions. And they're like at each other's throats a lot. Maybe they agree and they have like, agendas that dovetail with each other. But sometimes they butt heads. And then when that happens, a lot of times heads end up rolling, right? And someone like Epstein had his hands in a lot of pies for a long time. But his bread and butter wasn't sex trafficking. It was financial crime. Right. And there's been no interest in looking at that from the mainstream media at all, and what the implications of that are. And some of them are very, very significant as it relates to Wall Street today, and even things like the 2008 economic crisis, the collapse of Bear Stearns. Like Epstein's relationship with Wall Street and the banking sector is totally insane. And it's the same too, a lot of his relationship with the Clinton family. There's just been the focus of Epstein taking Bill Clinton around on this plane, and
Planes,
people were
yeah.
like, oh, that means Bill Clinton must have had sex with minors. But beyond that, the reason he was on the plane in the first place is because Epstein was helping him set up the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Health Access Initiative.
Great.
And that came after Epstein's whole White House relationship essentially revolving around criminal activity disguised as political fundraising for the Clintons, some of which was investigated by Congress. And some of which also ended up in, things like Vince Foster's suicide note, like all sorts of crazy ties to funny money business with the Clintons, and no interest in looking at that even from the conservative angle. And I would argue a lot of that is because of the Israel affiliation with Epstein. And you have a lot of the preferred conservative commentators about some issues in conservative land, whatever, being people like Alan Dershowitz, who are tied up in this whole thing. So I mean, there's obvious limits about where people want to go with this particular story. That's why I think mainstream media is focused so much on this salacious stuff, because they're essentially covering up a lot of the other provably criminal activity that, the people backing Epstein were using him for. Because again, it's not just sex trafficking, but that's what, one, it gets clicks and is also a useful justification for, justifying why he was taken out when he was taken out. Right.
Can we just do a quick tangent of what's the Clinton
Sure.
Health Access Initiative? You mentioned that. I've heard of Clinton Foundation, but like I don't know too much.
It's
about
like
that
a
one.
subset of sort of the Clinton philanthropy. So you've stuff like the Clinton Global Initiative, right, which is sort of came out of the same thing. And Epstein helped set that up, for example, as well, according to his defense lawyers in 2007, at least. And the Clinton Health Access Initiative, it ended up later teaming up with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation pretty extensively. And you have Epstein also really involved in Bill Gates' philanthropy. And before Epstein was infamous, Bill Gates actually credited Epstein with essentially designing CHI is the acronym, right, of the Health Access Initiative. Its whole HIV/AIDS program was designed by Epstein. Bill Clinton essentially said that. And this is disturbing because, as we know now and has been admitted by The Guardian, the New York Times, and other mainstream media outlets, Epstein was a eugenicist and very interested in that type of stuff. He was also trying to collect the DNA of all the people in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a lot of whom, are not white, right? Just like the focus of the HIV/AIDS program that he helped design under the Clinton philanthropies, of course, was focused largely on Africa, right? So a lot of weird stuff going on there, to say the very least. And again, people aren't really interested on that. They're just interested in saying how many flights on the Lolita Express Clinton flew, and not what those flights were about, and not what the Epstein-Clinton relationship really was about, which was, financial criminal activity.
And I always thought it was so weird that it was like, it was the Lolita Express being like this thing you always heard about. Like, he had a plane. It was called the Lolita Express. It's like off of Kubrick's movie and the book, the Nabokov book before that, which is like, that always felt like something to me, like some kind of plant. Like that was just like, just like a distract, like, here's my plane called the like pedophile plane, basically.
Yeah. Well, even before, so the other thing about Epstein and planes, he, along with Leslie Wexner, have the CIA airline relocated to run cargo expressly for Leslie Wexner's company in the mid-90s, the same time he's doing all these White House meetings. Southern Air Transport, right? Which Southern Air Transport in the 1980s was involved in Iran-Contra, including to Arkansas, where Bill Clinton was governor, and of course Clinton himself had connections to the Iran-Contra scandal. And then Clinton's in the White House, and then that same airline gets active again, directly connected to Epstein and Wexner. And instead of going from Miami to Latin America, where it was running arms and drugs for the whole Contra support apparatus, it starts going from Columbus, Ohio, where the Limited is based, Wexner's company, to Hong Kong and back. And at the same time, there was this political fundraising scandal. One of the central figures in the White House of that scandal was Mark Middleton, who Epstein was meeting with at the time. And that scandal is remembered or colloquially referred to a lot as Chinagate, because a lot of it involved stuff in the Far East, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and a lot of the places where this, Southern Air Transport route between the limited and the East was going. And it's very bizarre because essentially Wexner and Epstein were specifically looking for an airline with intelligence ties. They tried to do a couple different airlines before settling on Southern Air Transport. The other one was Aero Air, which was also tied up in Iran-Contra. Do you know how many airlines were in the U.S. at this point in time in U.S. history? And they literally go after like the two that are most tied up with this crap. It's pretty telling, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, you mentioned Bill Gates. He is somebody we talk about a lot on here. And that even tends to be the sentiment that everyone gets mad about for Bill Gates. Like, it's okay to get mad about him because he went
or
on
like
the
Klaus Schwab. They're like
Yeah.
these people in the front, and
and it's because and like the first thing people say about Gates when they first learn that maybe he's not the savior of their life or any of this stuff is
I'm
that
amazed
he went,
people think that.
It is. I'm a Silicon Valley guy. Like I live in Silicon Valley. There's people who are like, no, he's great. Like he's amazing.
It's jarring when you hear it in the wild.
Worship. It's a problem.
It's really sad. Like it's really sad. And so he ends up, you know, the thing. But people will go, yeah, but you know, the whole Epstein plane thing. Like it is a thing. Like they get kind of like no, I'll admit it's a little weird that he went on the plane. Like, and it's like, no, I'm not gonna lie, like that's probably like I don't even have that in the top 10 things that I hate about Bill Gates. Like it's on the list. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm not saying it's nothing, and I'm not saying he wasn't doing weird sex stuff. It's quite clear to me that he was. However, this is a guy who has consistently just kind of like lied his way to the top and he's played the game better than anybody, you know? And so we talk about Gates a lot, but like, to you, I would love to hear just the Bill Gates anti-Bill Gates manifesto if we could.
Okay, well, do you want the anti-Bill Gates manifesto as it relates to his Epstein relationship, or just
no, actually no, because I know how it seems like I know how bad that is, but I just like people don't know about, you know, people don't realize that it's the largest private landowner in America, right? A farmland, I should say.
Yeah.
And just the things like that where those don't get talked about, right? His health is our stuff and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, he has a lot of insane influence over public policy. And frankly, I don't think that people in the national government, for example, in the US or elsewhere, really write their own laws anymore. They essentially get handed policy papers from a bunch of think tanks or groups. And so, you know, when you look at someone like Bill Gates or even groups like the World Economic Forum, essentially what they exist to do is to connect those policies drafted by these crazy people to national governments. And, you know, essentially what national governments are seen as are enabling environments for these particular policies. And so Bill Gates is one of these guys that sort of does that. And he uses his foundation for that purpose. So the foundation will go and donate to, you know, the World Health Organization, for example.
Yeah.
Or different entities, and then be like, well, in exchange for more donations, we'd like to see you enact these policies, right? Because Bill Gates has been pretty open that his philanthropy isn't philanthropy as most Americans conceive of it, right? It's not altruistic. It's done. He sees it as a return on investment, you know?
Yeah.
And he's even openly said that, for example, about his philanthropy as it relates to vaccines and vaccinations, that it's all about the return on investment for him. And some of that is about altering policy agendas, you know, for his benefit, whether it's, you know, things that make him money or whether it's things that he wants to see, you know, changed in the world as it is today, or wants to see people nudged in a certain direction. So people that see Bill Gates as this altruistic philanthropist are mistaken. You know, he's taken a page out of the book from the Rockefeller family. He sort of created this, the use of philanthropy to launder their extremely criminal reputations. And you know, Bill Gates is one of several billionaires that follow and have followed that same model. I mean, Epstein himself, right, used to be promoted by Bill Clinton as a great philanthropist before his arrest, before 2008. And actually, Epstein was very influential in shifting philanthropy in general to this new model, which is really, you know, it's impact investing essentially disguised as altruism, you know? And that's why he was so involved with the Clinton Foundation and also the Gates Foundation. And, you know, people like Michael Milken, who's like a Wall Street criminal from the 80s and a convicted felon. He created the Milken Institute in the same period of time and is now a philanthropist also, not an insane junk bond trader that almost collapsed the economy, right? So it's amazing what, you know, PR money can do for some people.
Yeah, and
As it relates, oh, sorry.
No, and I guess what I'm saying is like, you know, a lot of times when you see things about Gates, a lot of people can say like, okay, if we didn't have Bill Gates, somebody else would take his place as the health czar. The things that I don't even know if that's true though. He feels like one of one kind of guy. Like I think I don't know if anybody could do it as good as quote unquote good, effective as I should say, as him. Like he seems like he has that extra gear.
He likes being out there doing this stuff. He likes being the face of these policies, I think. I mean, he's kind of like a dweeby guy, and he probably feels like, look at me, I'm on top. I get invited on all this stuff, and all these people praise me, and I pay all these, you know, he funds a bunch of media organizations, like the BBC, for example, is one.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, they help him launder his reputation, right? Because, you know, back in the 90s, Bill Gates was not really well liked at all. And he was being sued by the government because Microsoft was a monopoly and all of this stuff. He's a very ruthless businessman. So for people to think that he's all of a sudden had this sudden change after being sued by the US government via antitrust laws. And he's like, I just want to help the poor Africans.
Yeah.
Even though his dad was, you know, tied up in eugenics stuff.
At Harvard, right? Was that Harvard?
No, he ran Planned Parenthood before Planned Parenthood was necessarily about like birth control and stuff like that.
When it was way,
you know, the Margaret Sanger organization. Yeah, it had a lot of associations with the American Eugenics Society at the time that Bill Gates' father was involved with it.
I also think it's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's fine.
I also think it's crazy. I mean, yeah, there's the computer stuff, and obviously he's a scammer from the start. But even more recently, the India vaccine campaign getting sued by the Supreme Court of India and every African country. There's always some major group or political group that wants them out of there. And the other thing I've noticed is how cheap a lot of these organizations, like, you know, like I went to a university, dropped out, that was sponsored by Bill Gates, and he gave him like $4 million, which is not that much money, you know. And they're like, "Oh, sure, we'll do whatever you want," you know, and all these people sell out pretty cheap, you know, for stuff
some
he finds
people
in his
do,
couch cushions, you know, it's crazy. Yeah, but I don't know.
But well, the thing I do want to make a point about as it relates to Epstein is that I would argue that it's not really the Bill Gates Epstein relationship, it's the Epstein Microsoft relationship. It goes far beyond Bill Gates.
Wow.
And the fact that they try and keep the mainstream media focus about the Gates Epstein relationship on beginning in 2011 when that is provably false is because at that point in time Gates was no longer calling the shots at Microsoft. So they take Microsoft out of the equation, despite the fact that Epstein had a very close relationship with Microsoft's chief technology officer going back into the late 90s and early 2000s, Nathan Myhrvold. And then also another top Microsoft executive, Linda Stone, very involved with Epstein as well, connected him to MIT Media Lab and stuff like that. And she actually hired as her secretary one of the women from Epstein's entourage, one of his ex-girlfriends. And there's a lot of connections there and a few other people as well. And this one woman that Epstein was essentially using as I would argue for sexual blackmail, but also more than that, because she wasn't a minor. She's like, he paid for her education. She became a neurosurgeon and then became his science advisor. She became Bill Gates' science advisor in the early 2000s. And then, but so Epstein sort of had two parallel sex trafficking operations, and one of them didn't involve minors. It really involved cultivating women when they're in university or a little bit younger, and sort of making them into the perfect woman and then shopping them off to elites in his circle, you know, sort of acting as a matchmaker, I guess.
Crazy.
And he did this on numerous occasions. Allegedly Trump's current wife and the girlfriend he had before Melania, Trump was connected to them through Epstein this way. And there's other people as well, but this particular girl I'm talking about now, Melanie Walker, ended up being sort of married off to a top Microsoft executive as well named Steven Sinofsky. So there's a whole bunch of weird Microsoft connections, and also Epstein went on an official Microsoft trip to Russia in the late 90s with Nathan Myhrvold. And why was he involved with that? It's there's a bunch of odd connections there, and it's a broader issue of the Epstein Silicon Valley connections. Having, for example, it's known that Epstein hosted at his home people like Google co-founder Sergey Brin, right? And they try and make it just about Bill Gates again too, but after he left a top Silicon Valley company. But now you have the top people of Google. You have Elon Musk knowing Epstein. You have Mark Zuckerberg knowing Epstein. You have Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn knowing Epstein. All of these guys, the bigwigs at Silicon Valley, had deep ties to Epstein. Jeff Bezos as well. There's no interest on talking about them. And this is a broader issue of the Maxwell network specifically being really involved in the subversion of technology for the purpose of blackmail and mass surveillance, going back to the 1980s and to Robert Maxwell himself. He's, of course, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, but also like Ghislaine's sisters. They were also involved with Microsoft and all this weird tech stuff in the same period. And then you have Epstein and Ghislaine having a parallel involvement, and Ghislaine also having direct involvement with some of her sister's companies that were teamed up with Bill Gates and stuff. Very bizarre ties there. So I think the interest in, again, it's a limited hangout when it comes to the Gates-Epstein relationship. They want it focused just on the philanthropy stuff just after 2011, even though it's provable that they had a relationship before 2001, Epstein and Bill Gates. They won't touch it.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
The Ghislaine stuff is crazy. People just assume that she came out of nowhere, but you mentioned her father and her sisters, and that's something I don't know quite as much about, but it's these people are groomed into these
and Ghislaine definitely was by her father, who was a crazy person, a complete insane narcissist. And it's very clear if you look into Ghislaine's childhood, she was extremely psychologically abused as a child, and then basically turned into what Robert Maxwell described as the female him. And he clearly saw Ghislaine as an extension of himself, not as her own person, and arguably saw his other children as that too, but Ghislaine he used for different purposes.
Wow.
Because she was sexually attractive. The other female siblings he didn't think were, right? So he tried to set her up with different powerful clans, including the Kennedy family. Actually, when he first made his foray into the U.S. In the late 80s, early 90s, he was trying very hard to get Ghislaine set up with a Kennedy.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, and it's nuts because there's a sentiment of the spaces that our show kind of is involved with on whether there's left-leaning people or right-leaning people. A lot of people think that there's some sort of collapse happening in America or the West or whatever you want to say. Like there's left-leaning people that will say late-stage capitalism, it's all crumbling down. This is just kind of what happens after years and years of capitalism. But then there's people on the right that are like, no, just because of lack of morals, open borders, whatever, anything like that there's another collapse happening. I have a tough time believing that there's an actual collapse happening because I think the Gates, Clinton, all these people would be going down with us if that was the case. They're not. That's the thing. Like they always have money on the back end, right? Like as far as the COVID austerity, that made more billionaires, right?
Totally.
Like that made
it
more
was designed to do that. It was a wealth transfer, and every preceding economic crisis has been that. I would argue that potentially the only difference we're seeing now is that there's a major effort to completely reimagine and remake what we conceive of as money. Right. There's an effort to introduce these central bank digital currencies, the idea of programmable money. And I think it's pretty clear if you enter into that paradigm that just like there's a two-tiered justice system today, the programmable money thing is a two-tiered system of control. Certain things that apply or that would apply about how you can and can't spend your money in a CBDC sort of paradigm would apply to the regular people, but probably wouldn't apply to Bill Gates, right? Because it's very unlikely that even though someone like Bill Gates goes around, talking about climate change and all this stuff, he's still very personally not going to give up his multiple homes, his private jet, and all of his stuff. It's rules for the rest of us, not for these people, right? And so, I think they're not threatened by that paradigm if it were to pass, you know what I mean? So I would agree with you if it wasn't really for this whole effort to reimagine what the economy is in general on a global scale, because there really isn't a country of significance today that is not developing a central
Yeah.
bank digital currency. And whether you think, Russia and the BRICS and China and the BRICS countries are the good guys going against evil US
Right.
empire, or like, any sort, or any sort of, they're all developing this stuff. They're all going this
Yeah.
way. And to me, that says that in general, national governments around the world are getting increasingly interested in domestic control in a way that is very disturbing. And I'm not going to co-sign that. And I don't really care what national government it is.
Exactly. Exactly. You can't, because
Mhm.
that, to me, it's like, if you thought that, okay, the West was against the East, almost in like a team sport kind of way, like, sure,
It
I'm sure
seems
it's
team
some,
sporty. Yeah.
yeah, it does seem team sporty. However, with response to COVID of all these countries, it seemed rather coordinated, right?
It was
Enemies of
totally
enemies,
coordinated.
totally coordinated, to the point where it's like, okay, well, even if it was team sporty before 2020, there was a consolidation, right? Like there
Totally.
was even like some could argue before that it was always that way. Not really something of interest to me. All I see is that you don't get to I guess what I'm trying to say is like it's clear that I don't think that the U.S. is interested in a quote unquote like war with China. Like, you know what I mean? I think they want to stoke the flames with it. I think there's certain things with it, but at the end of the day, like, Gates is friendly with China. Like that wouldn't be happening if we were going into like war, right? With China or something.
It depends. I think, again, if you think of capital does not respect national sovereignty. It's transnational, right?
Okay.
So all these billionaires and stuff I don't really see them, whether they're based in the US or elsewhere, necessarily as having allegiance to the country they're citizens of or they live in. Their allegiance is to their money and their power, and that is transnational these days. For sure.
Right.
So in terms of what you said earlier about how the left looks at this for how the right looks at this, I honestly think neither of these are really true.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is that what's going on right now is really the enacting of a very long-standing plan that goes back to the 70s, if not earlier. So I sort of wrote about this in my last piece about the background behind Jamie Dimon, the current head of JP Morgan Chase. And I was writing about Samuel Pisar. So Samuel Pisar is when he was alive, was a famous lawyer based in Paris. But he is the stepfather and essentially the person who raised Anthony Blinken, the current U.S. Secretary of State. So, obviously his influence is relevant today. He was also probably Robert Maxwell's best friend, definitely his lawyer and his confidant, and, obviously involved in a lot of the shady stuff that Maxwell himself engaged in. And in the early 70s, Samuel Pisar is testifying before Congress. And he's talking about the rise of what he refers to as the trans-ideological corporation. And he's essentially talking about how private Western capitalist enterprise were intermingling and essentially fusing with communist state-run enterprises, and that all the businesses of the world were consolidating power together to create a global, unified economic structure that was more powerful than national governments, and that the nation state was becoming irrelevant.
Yeah,
that was in the early 70s, and he was just telling Congress that straight up. And there's a lot of other groups like that have similar ambitions. So a good example would be the Trilateral Commission, which is, from the Rockefeller nexus. And so again, you have the Rockefellers being very powerful billionaires, shaping in very significant ways major assets of American life for over a century, including essentially designing a lot of the current education system and the current healthcare system in the US going back to the early 20th century, among other major influences. And David Rockefeller in particular was the guy that ran Chase Bank, now JP Morgan Chase, that Chase, right? Which has always been very tied to intelligence and other things. And actually in World War II, the Rockefellers had their own private intelligence apparatus. They essentially operate as their own private CIA, I guess you could say. So the Rockefellers are a very crazy family. But the Trilateral Commission has this same goal of creating sort of this economic structure that's more powerful than national governments, sort of like a shadow government, right? So a lot of people, mainly on the right these days, like to use the term deep state. But ultimately what they're trying and often fail to express with that term is that there's these transnational power structures that are much more powerful than the power structures we're told actually run things.
Yeah.
Right. And more often than not, this involves intelligence agencies and it involves organized crime. And that's because intelligence agencies and organized crime have lots of similarities. And ultimately, what they come to get, the reason they come together is because it's all about money and power, and they're above the law. Right. And so, what we're having is them essentially creating a mega cartel of economic power. A lot of this is through the dominating of the banking sector. And again, this transnational stuff over time that's going on, with capital flows and other things. And it's all about, I think it's really all about that at the end of the day. So I think a lot of this talk about nation state versus nation state, when you consider that some of the most powerful people in the world have been attempting to build something that sits above that since the 70s, and that they've been wildly successful. It's hard to not see it as team sport stuff. And when you consider how influential, for example, the Rockefellers were in the opening up of China in the 70s with the Kissinger visit and all of this stuff, and how China has developed since then, the Rockefellers actually take a lot of credit for the current model of the Chinese economy, which, China has, I think, more billionaires than the United States does.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So it's really hard to argue. I would say that they're like classically communist, like a lot of people claim to do. And if you think about it, people that actually look into this stuff, there's like this phenomena in China that's been referred to as the princelings or the red princes, essentially children of powerful party leaders from yesteryear who were put in charge of state-run businesses and became fabulously corrupt. Some of them even being disowned by their parents that were party elders because they were so excessively capitalist and corrupt. One of these was actually involved with that Clinton scandal I referred to earlier, Chinagate. He's in charge of China's main weapons manufacturing conglomerate, basically China's top arms dealer. And he was disowned by his father, who was a communist party leader, for being so against the whole communist ethos, and was basically just like a Western capitalist fat cat, is how he described his own son, and disowned him. Essentially, right? So a lot of people looking at China from the left don't even bother to incorporate this sort of stuff into how they look at the country, and I think that's really problematic. And I would argue essentially what we're seeing now is sort of a baton pass from the unipolar model to the so-called multipolar model.
Right.
And like you mentioned earlier, COVID policy, biosecurity policy, technocratic policies, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, all of this stuff is even farther advanced in the BRICS countries than it is in the United States. And I would argue that, essentially what we've had over the past several decades in the US is an effort to really going into overdrive, starting with Reagan, is a hollowing out of US economic and military power for the purpose of this planned transition. So whether that means that World War III never actually happens because the US collapses beforehand and power shifts that way, or if the US is intentionally being led into World War III knowing it will lose and this baton pass will happen, I mean, either are possible. It really depends on how things play out. But I don't really see it. I think a lot of this seems just so scripted to me these days.
Yeah. Exactly. And once as you said, once the history behind this stuff, it's like, okay, it's all lining up. It's all lining up. There's nothing that's like really straying from that. But you did mention, central banking digital currency, huge thing. Now, full disclosure, my co-host and I have owned and traded Bitcoin before. So we have.
That's okay. I go on a lot of Bitcoin podcasts. I tend to get a lot.
Yeah, which I just saw that recent. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I to be honest, I'm not a maximalist of it at all. I was just kind of like, well, it's rising. Let me see if I can get some. Okay, it's falling. Let me sell. I was just one of those. I was just like one of those guys. Like my co-host actually would sit there and trade and do the charts and stuff like that. There's look, at the end of the day, I hate the new Palm Pay that they have at Whole Foods. You can pay with your palm and stuff like that.
Don't do it.
Oh, I never
People
will.
should just opt out.
No, I have a chip card and I don't even really want to use that. But there's places that I live in Silicon Valley. There's places that just don't take cash. It's insane.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there was I it felt fake. There was an extremely fake coin. Like at Starbucks, there was a coin shortage during COVID. I was like, no.
Oh, the coin shortage was fake. Yeah.
That just sounded fake. I was like, you just don't want to have change for me. That's like the thing. Like it sounds like that. So anyways, nonetheless, what if you could give us a history of like central banking digital currency? I know you've alluded to it already, because like I've seen the advent of a lot of things in Silicon Valley, but it happens slower than like we see in movies and stuff, where it's like this drastic rollout to where you kind of just get used to it after a while. But like, how far back does this go?
In terms of central bank digital currencies, I'm actually not sure that much about where the idea essentially came from. I don't know. I mean, I've only really reported on it since it became more out in the open, I guess, during and post COVID era. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I only really noticed it then because it became very overt, this push towards digitalizing literally every part of our lives under what, the umbrella term for that tends to be the fourth industrial revolution.
Right.
Right. Which, the people that created that term define as sort of a fusion of our biological and digital selves, which is creepy. But it's really a push towards that. And you have major people in the national security state of the United States wanting that to happen, not as completely aside from the central bankers. People like the National Security Commission on AI, which was essentially the most powerful people in Silicon Valley with the military and the intelligence community. It was headed by Eric Schmidt, who has basically his own office that he pays the salaries of in the Biden administration, working on stuff for him. Very crazy stuff. So, Eric, their whole thing was the U.S. will lose its military and economic hegemony, which of course is all the national security state has ever cared about in the U.S., unless the U.S. adopts artificial intelligence and these technologies to an extent farther than anyone else. And so their main competitor in this regard is China. China already has like a mega cities model. A lot of people are onboarded almost exclusively onto paying with their smartphones and using the smartphone for everything.
Right.
And so they say we have to go beyond that. And this is before COVID in 2019. And this included, eliminating cash, forcing payments to be, cash apps on people's phones, eliminating in-person doctor visits, forcing a telehealth paradigm. All of this stuff got rolled out or advanced or promoted during COVID, including self-driving cars, the elimination of private car ownership. That was all in there. And they were talking about this in 2019. The intelligence community, the military, and the most powerful people in Silicon Valley, which I would argue are essentially the people that run the United States these days.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And so that's where they want to take it. And within this PowerPoint, you have quotes from Kissinger and other people, which is interesting because Eric Schmidt is being described as the new Kissinger, and he's actually written books with Henry Kissinger about AI. It's essentially quoting this idea from Kissinger that in order to avoid war with China, we just have to adopt these policies faster and more extensively than China and collaborate with them and building a paradigm where that is so for everybody everywhere.
Yeah. And people like my, my relatives who will watch Fox News and be scared of China all day. They're kind of like, they might not like that idea, but they're like, well, it's for war with China. We have to, we have to do it. So it's the state of fear, the fear model. Yeah.
So they present literally only two possibilities with China. It's either war or it's this. This is the peace camp in the national security state.
That's interesting.
Exactly.
And the peace camp sees peace only as coming through complete top-down technocratic control.
Yeah. Scary.
Crazy stuff.
No, and like, you hear about people like my parents love it. My parents who, they're 60 and they love they love Venmo. They love all that stuff. Like I want to hand them cash
for them.
Yeah, no, it's great for them, but I'm like, they remember not using it. Like I understand a 21-year-old person loving, digital currency because most of their life they've seen at least a card transaction as the primary thing. But it's crazy how well how a generation that remembers having to actually balance a checkbook and things like that, they just adopt Palm Pay. Like my dad signed up for Palm Pay. It
boomers
scares me.
have been primed for this whole pitch of convenience.
Well,
Oh,
that's
look
one
how
of the jokes on
convenient.
yeah,
And
that's
they're
one of the
like, oh
jokes
my
on this
God,
podcast.
yeah, look how cool this
Oh,
is, guys. And they go
exactly.
and, all the boomer jokes essentially come from there, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, look how cool Facebook is. And like,
Uh,
oh, I'll never use Facebook again.
Uh-huh.
My aunt just messaged me about, I mean,
yeah,
100%. Yeah.
they're primed for falling into these traps essentially. But here's the thing. If you cannot imagine yourself living without your smartphone or living without these apps, they have already enslaved you, basically.
Yeah, it's true. No, it's true.
It's the carrot to get you into the corral, basically. And if you can't live without it, they have you.
Yeah, and also just
essentially.
even in a smaller way, like it's just easy to just not even care about the price of things when you can buy it with your phone. Like I know obviously people see it, but like it's a lot easier than having to get out a set amount of dollars out of your wallet. 'Cause you're like, damn, that's actually a lot of money. Like I'm pulling out of my wallet.
No, but it's even crazier on that, the mind games people play about this stuff. I know somebody in independent journalism that's ostensibly against this stuff, and they refuse to stop unlocking their smartphone with their face. If you're against facial recognition, why can't you just go back to like a little number code or something? At the very least, you're essentially letting them develop their facial recognition technology with you. And if you can't stop doing that, even if you work in this field, I mean, I find that really troubling personally.
Yeah, because people scoff at like the idea of like AI, taking control of things or whatever. A lot of people still see that as like crazy.
Well, I think some of that's a psyop, all the fear mongering about how powerful
Sure.
ChatGPT is and all this stuff. I think.
Oh, do you?
Oh yeah, because remember a couple months before ChatGPT, there was this Google engineer who was like, "Oh, the Google chatbot, which is the same type of model that ChatGPT is sentient." You guys remember that?
Yeah,
and then it was all promoted by the New York Times and all this stuff, and then it was revealed that he'd heavily edited and basically faked the transcript that proved sentience. But they were running with it because they want people to sort of see AI as some sort of god, because they want to put AI in charge of the government. Because when you put AI in charge of the government, it prints out these policies, and then you're like, oh, well, Eric Schmidt has literally said this. AI is so much smarter than us that it made this decision and we can't question it because we can't understand how it reached this conclusion, but it's superior, so we got to do what it says.
Yeah.
And that for these guys is the perfect like Wizard of Oz like screen for them to get away with every insane policy they've ever dreamed of and
100%.
never have accountability ever, because it'll just be like computer says yes, computer says no. And it's Kissinger and Eric Schmidt that wrote a whole book about that paradigm essentially and why it should happen.
There's an interesting thing
Awful
going
idea.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing going now where US policy is becoming so openly hostile to crypto innovation. Which is totally understandable from their point. While at the same time, this AI push is going absolutely crazy with the central bank digital currencies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so funny. I don't expect like normies to understand, what Bitcoin is, but it's so interesting how they really still have no idea what it is and what makes it special, or any decentralized crypto special.
Well, yeah, a lot of people, for example, that are just casual observers assume that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are synonymous. So like all cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin are the same. But then you have Gary Gensler, the SEC chair, saying that Bitcoin's a commodity, but all other cryptos are securities. And that should just tell like the regular layperson that like there is a difference, right? And to maybe look into that if they're interested, I guess. But I think the reason you're seeing this big regulatory crackdown is because the Fed is preparing for central bank digital currency time. And if you have any other digital currencies that are competitors to the CBDC will not be widely used and adopted, because the whole reason they want a CBDC, as admitted by heads of central banks, whether it's the head of the BIS or the head of the European Central Bank or whatever, it's all about this programmable money functionality, meaning they can make your money work and not work under certain conditions as they see fit.
If you say the right thing or the wrong thing.
Well, that's one potential application, but so in CBDCs that have already been rolled out, for example, China's digital yuan, it expires.
Fuck. Yeah.
So the central bank decides whether you spend or don't spend, or you save or spend your money. You can't save, essentially.
And I remember Mark Cuban floated that idea for our stimulus. I remember like the stimulus check. He was like, hey, it's like got to be spent at like, in the economy, like you can't save it or else like he was like that I don't think that's what happened, but like that idea was being floated out there. And I remember people thinking like, wow, so true. It needs to stimulate the economy.
So, right.
Yeah.
So maybe if it, they start with the expiration date and that's the only programmable function it has for now, but you give that type of micromanagerial control to these people and they're going to push the envelope because they always have. And why would they do anything different than what they've done throughout history? And why give them that insane power? So anyway, that functionality. So for example, in the paradigm where you can get financially punished for thought crime or financially punished for your dietary choices and stuff like that. If you have a currency that's equally valid, also digital, that does not impose those restrictions on you, you're not going to use the one that imposes restrictions on you, right? So the Fed has to destroy, first of all, they have to destroy stable coins, they have to destroy competitors to the Fed Now service, and really any sort of digital currency competitor has to go.
This is the first time anyone's brought this up on the podcast. Glenn, are you aware that the Fed is creating a US dollar coin called Fed Now, which I think is
it's not a coin, it's like a settlement service.
Oh, okay.
So they can it's a 24/7 transaction.
I love that.
So
name.
instead of
Fed
just
Now.
having to bank and stuff like that during banking hours, right? It can be whenever. And this is some people have argued that's why like Signature Bank was shut down, and I think Silvergate also, because they sort of had systems that were seen sort of as being competitors to that. And then a lot of these recent bank issues cause problems for major stable coins like USDC, for example.
Yeah.
So I think that's sort of the target there. But in addition, some of the stuff that we've been talking about before you brought up crypto and that are also related to crypto is this broader effort to essentially control the internet and eliminate online anonymity as well as financial anonymity in general. And so the entity that I think people should pay attention to in that regard is a public-private partnership that's housed within the World Economic Forum. And it's very important for Americans because some of the biggest banks in the US are part of it, like Bank of America, as is the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the US Secret Service. So, those parts of our government are involved in drafting these policies. And what they argue for, there's a couple things they argue for. One is the merging of Wall Street banks with their regulators and law enforcement for the purpose of preventing cybercrime. Interesting. And then another policy they wish to see affected was actually pitched during the Obama administration, this whole idea of a driver's license for the internet, meaning a government issued ID tied to your internet activity. And we're already seeing efforts to sort of push this through when Elon Musk owned Twitter, where people for Twitter Blue can connect their government issued ID and be super verified.
Yeah.
That was always the goal, right? For social media, is to have it tied to a government issued ID, because no more troll accounts, right? No more anonymous stuff. They'll know everybody they'll know who says what. Right. And you're already having people being arrested for social media posts in the US. William Barr in the Trump administration made this official government policy. He created a program. The acronym of it is DEEP. And it's essentially a pre-crime program. And people that have posted inflammatory crap on Facebook and elsewhere have been arrested just for those posts. And that's a very troubling paradigm. And if you have this government issued ID stuff, and also Barr, when he was attorney general, argued for a backdoor into encryption and all of this stuff. And that's also being argued for by the Biden administration. So, Democrat or Republican, it's all going in the same direction. So the Partnership Against Cybercrime, they say all of this has to happen to stop bad things from happening on the internet. Right. And so if AI is deemed as a threat or anything, hacks, whatever, they're going to come in and say like, oh, okay, now there needs to be a global regulatory effort to make the internet safe again. Yeah. And then you're going to see this push to have a government issued ID connected to your internet activity. And they've been planning that a really long time. And the other part of it that's mentioned in their policy papers of this particular group is about crypto. They argue that cryptocurrency is a major driver of cybercrime, and that in order to stop that, not only do you have to use governments to basically prohibit people from using cryptocurrency as legal tender, you also have to drive the value of cryptocurrency to zero, because as long as it has a value, they argue it will be a driver of cybercrime. And they define cybercrime not just as hacks or ransomware attacks, which is sort of their selling point initially, but if you actually read the policy paper, they argue that people that spread misinformation are also cyber criminals. And they talk about stuff like pulling out websites by the roots, like completely eliminating their web presence unilaterally and doing all this stuff through this fusion of like banks and law enforcement and all this stuff to go after people they deem cyber criminals. And they even talk about going outside of existing regulatory and legal frameworks, meaning breaking the law in order to do that. And again, the FBI and Department of Justice and the U.S. Secret Service are drafting this policy. They're like the public part of the public-private partnership, along with UK and Israeli intelligence. That's the WEF partnership against cybercrime. I think more people should look at them.
I agree. I agree. And now
they're nuts.
So you've been extremely gracious with your time, and I again really appreciate you coming on with us. But now I have to ask you one more thing, because I asked this to everybody who does like extensive research on this stuff. We had somebody by the name of Corey Morningstar on a long time ago.
Oh yeah, Corey's great.
She's wonderful. However, you could see that a lot, everything she learned kind of contributed to stress about it, because the fact, either whether it's other people not going along with her, like how do you guys not see this, or just, oh my gosh, this feels so overwhelming and insurmountable, it can kind of wear on you. Do you experience the same thing, where it's just kind of like, man, like I love uncovering this information, I love making it available to people, but what do we do, you know?
Yeah, I mean, not anymore. I mean, I kind of just do what I do and hope it has an impact and put it out there, because I have to do something. And thankfully, you know, I've worked pretty hard over the years and have a platform where like a decent amount of people sort of listen to what I say. And I've had a pretty good track record in being able to reach certain audiences that maybe some other people with similar information may not be able to for whatever reason, or maybe because I started off sort of on a progressive left outlet like Mint Press News, and was always tried to sort of frame my work so that it could be, I was trying to appeal beyond the left-right paradigm, right? But I mean, sometimes, you have days where you want to smack your head against a wall, and other days you feel really hopeful about stuff. But ultimately, a lot of this stuff, there's the responsibility you can take for your own life and, stuff you can do in your local community. But a lot of this big stuff is not necessarily like in my hands. And, if you're going to stress about stuff you don't ultimately have control over, that's probably not going to end up being very good for you. So it's more important to stress and worry about the stuff you can control in your own life. The other thing too is that a lot of people get really strung out by like how dark this stuff is, but it's only really gotten this dark because people haven't said or done anything about it, and people haven't taken responsibility for their own lives, and instead we've been conditioned to do it, of course, but essentially been giving our outsourcing everything about our lives to corporations that want to enslave us all. Right? So that needs to stop, and power needs to come back to the people. However that happens, you can only do, if you're one, just a regular person, you can only do so much to affect that. Right. But you can do your part and do what you can, manage what you can control in your own life to push towards that goal. But it's going to take a lot of people coming together to build some sort of parallel system or parallel paradigm to avoid being herded into what's being made for us by these these people that we've been talking about today. But I think it's also important to keep your head in the game in a sense, because the main tool of these people is fear. So the more susceptible you are to fear-driven media campaigns, which a lot of people are. I mean, I think we saw this in a big way with COVID, but even before that, you have post 9/11 in the United States and, other times, other panics, a lot of which are generated by the media. The more susceptible you are to that, the more of a sucker you'll be for these guys going forward, and the more likely you'll be willing to trade your few remaining freedoms for a feeling of safety and security from people that are just, consistent liars. So, if they're going to tell you it's going to make you safe, that's just it's like an abusive relationship. where they, emotional abusers or abusers in general keep their victims like roped in by telling them all this stuff that plays their emotions and the good stuff about people. And it's that way for the elites as well. Like, we have to care about the planet, we have to care about each other, and they sort of play on these, your pull on your heartstrings and stuff, but they have no intention, they don't care about that stuff.
Yeah.
Right. They're just using it because they want you to keep playing their game, and they want you to keep outsourcing your power to them, right? So they can run your life. And it's like walking out of an emotionally abusive relationship, our relationship with power.
100%.
Yeah.
The people in power right now are essentially abusers on a mass scale. So you have to just say no and walk away and go like no contact and build your own system, and don't give them any power over you anymore. And we have to do that as a society. And also, when you're scared of these people, you are also giving them power over you. I mean, fear is paralyzing, right? And to paraphrase the science fiction book Doom, it's the mind killer, right? And I mean that it pretty much is. I mean, you don't think straight when you're afraid. So I think there's a lot of mental changes, I guess, mental and emotional changes that people have to go through in order to really break out of this system. And I hope people do it quickly.
Our show has, like, I mean, for us, like, I remember, when I was in my like mid 20s and, really getting, quote unquote red pilled on a lot of stuff, I kind of was like trying to tackle these insurmountable objects on my own, where I'm like, we're going to hunt down all the crazy plane riding pedophiles. We're going to get them, like all that kind of stuff. And I didn't give up on that. But what I realized is that, like, if a bunch of people make the individual choice to maybe don't sign up for Palm Pay, maybe don't unlock your phone with
Definitely
your face, like just all these little things like that you can do. And if a lot of people do that stuff, a lot of these things are, maybe don't just run out for the brand new pharmaceutical thing. That's all I'm going to say. Don't just run out to it. Don't just sprint to a thing
because you're scared. Right.
Yeah,
that's what happened with COVID and the COVID vaccine for a lot of people. This is your only way out, people were told.
The only way out, and it still wasn't, right? But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. These people are thinking with a goldfish memory span, where they don't know the history, they don't necessarily know the future, they know the present, and the present is scary.
And again, it was people's empathy they used to manipulate them. Oh, if you don't take it, you don't care about your grandma, you're going to kill your grandma. You don't care about your family, you don't care about your kids, you don't care about your community. All of this stuff. It's emotional manipulation. These are like abusers.
Yeah, it's you've put it brilliantly there. And I just, like I said, like, thank you for the work that you do, because again, it's very thorough, it's very good, but you don't just say like, well, nothing we can do, like, just here's all this scary information, and
no, there is stuff people can do, but again, I think a lot of it's a mind game for a lot of people. And then the rest of it is taking personal responsibility for your life. And unfortunately, like, those of us that are younger are stuck sort of with this mess created by our parents' generation to an extent, who were really willing to have all this stuff outsourced because of convenience. And then you end up having a completely unresilient lifestyle in the US that's prone to all these supply chain shocks and can be cut off like that. A lot of Americans, if food stopped arriving to their grocery store because there was some sort of problem with gas or oil or whatever, I mean, tons of people would starve, right? A lot of the stuff that made gave America the culture that it has had historically is from people who cared a lot about personal and individual sovereignty and having that independence from the system. And I think Americans should consider getting back there, or at least looking to do that, whatever that looks like for you,
Absolutely. I think that's brilliant. Well, before we go, just some people don't know that you actually have a book out, and that's rather recently. It's
holding my webcam up right now.
Yeah, very nice.
Well, one of them. This is the other one. Volume 1. One Nation Under Blackmail. Volumes 1 and 2. Yeah.
We love books on this show. We have a whole thing called Gain of Fiction, where we talk about, fiction, all various works of fiction, because I do believe that even fiction tells you what's going to happen. But you're also, nonfiction's great too, especially when it's talking about stuff that we just talked about. So everybody go check out that book, Unlimited Hangout, Last American Vagabond. You can find Whitney in a lot of different places. Once again, thank you so much for your time, and everybody have a safe week. Okay, see you guys later.
Thank you.